Hello, welcome to I Got Board Game
Woo!
Friday edition.
Friday.
Everyone should be a Friday edition.
Mostly.
So today we are reviewing a game that is co-op and real time. Actually, which are both things I really like. Little spoiler of how I'm gonna review it. So co-op, real time, fantasy theme. And so today we are reviewing
The game called Dungeon Building with
Oh my
tape.
gosh, that's such an ugly picture.
Yeah. No, we are going to be doing a 5-minute dungeon.
5 minute
Woo! It's an old
dungeon.
box art, I think, but
No,
we'll talk about that.
So yeah, we'll get into the art. And so this review will be in 5 minutes. Not
Timing now.
sorry
Where's
that
my
it's
5 minute
not
sand
in
timer?
5 minutes, guys. But so 5 minute dungeon, like I mentioned, is a co-op real-time game for up to 5 players. Right, I believe so. My box actually is a fancy version that doesn't say that. Does it? Oh yeah, it does. Okay, so for 5 players, plays in 5 minutes. More realistically, like 10 minutes. Like if you want to include setting it up again. Which I don't know if that would
Insert
actually take
hours.
5 minutes either. Yeah, it's really easy to play a lot of times because it's actually it is timed for 5 minutes. So that's what you can expect for the game length. And so to get us into this review, I will do a brief overview of how the game plays. So let me just share with you a picture of the setup, which was actually uploaded onto Board Game Geek by Connor Reed, the designer of the game. And the game, actually, my version is from Kickstarter. So it was on Kickstarter originally. And so I have this kind of artwork on the box, which I'll show again later when we're comparing the artwork. But the way the game plays, so the way you set up is you all choose a hero board. So you can see in the picture like the barbarian, the ranger, the Valkyrie, and you take their deck of cards. So each character has their own deck of cards, which are color coded to them, red, green, yellow in this case. You shuffle those up and you put it on your player board and your draw pile side. And then you draw a hand of cards equal to the hand limit, which depends on how many players are actually playing. So it could be either 3, 4, or 5 cards is your hand limit. And then you draw that as your starting hand. You shuffle this deck in the middle of door cards along with some special door cards into it, depending on the boss you're fighting, the boss that you chose. In this case, the baby barbarian is boss number 1. And you shuffle that many of those door cards together and put it on that boss's board. And so basically the idea is you're all adventurers, fantasy adventurers, going through a dungeon together in 5 minutes. And so the deck represents the dungeon, basically each door that you're going through. And so to start, after you set up, as we just said, you'll use the timer, set it for 5 minutes, and hit the timer and flip the first door card. And so when you flip it, it might be something like this, an adorable slime, a monster basically, which has certain symbols on the bottom of it, color-coded symbols. And so then from your team's hand of cards that you each have, you're going to play cards to the table that match these symbols to basically defeat the monster that you flipped over. And so you'll just play the cards. You can communicate if you want, ask who has what, and just play the card that matches the symbol on the monster. Once you've played whatever's down here, you can basically just move it all aside. You defeated that monster, flip the next door card. And you just keep going. The door cards could be monsters, could be events that just tell you all to do something, like everyone discards a card from their hand, or everyone gives all their cards to another player. So you just do that, resolve it, move it out of the way, and flip the next door card. And you'll keep doing this one door card at a time until you finish the last door card, and then it'll reveal the symbols you need to defeat the boss. And so then you all will play cards from your hand to match all the symbols that are needed, however many there are. And then if you do that all within the 5 minutes, you've defeated the boss and won the game. If you ran out of the 5 minutes, then you lost the game. And that's basically it. There are some smaller details to like rules with drawing cards, when fighting a boss, stuff like that, that we'll get into during our review. But that's basically it. Really quick.
The other way to lose the game is if all players run out of cards to draw and play.
Yeah.
When no one can draw or play any more cards, even if you still have time.
Mm-hmm. And so that's basically it. Really simple, plays within that 5 minutes. And so we'll get back to our thoughts on it now, starting with the pros. John, the pros for the game.
It accomplishes what it wants to be, a 5-minute long game going through a dungeon. So I think that's one of the positive, obviously, I think a very positive aspect of this game is it plays very quickly, and it inspires the hecticness of what you would expect if you were rushing through a dungeon quickly to try to get to the end and fight the boss. Because you have 5 minutes, it's real time, right? As we said, it's a timer-based game. So, there is an element of speed and needing to move quickly in the game and how you play. So this one isn't like some of the other games we've talked about where some of the cooperative and working together games, which are timed or have real-time elements where you can't communicate or anything. You have full ability to communicate with each other in this game, but it's very hectic. So one of the small rules that we haven't mentioned, but is a fun one in this game, is basically when you play a card, as soon as it's played, it is considered played. There's no take backsies. As soon as it leaves your hand, as soon as it's laid on the table, it is considered a played card. You're not allowed to re-pick it up or anything like that. And that's a very important one because that happens quite a lot in this game. Because as we were talking about how you need to, the different door cards that are going through, and they'll have different symbols on them that you'll play as the players. There's no turn order, so anybody can be playing cards at the same time. So if two people are playing the same card that covers the same symbol on a card, it's not like, oh, well, one person covered it, so I get to take my card back, right? It's, no, both of you played the card. That means both of the cards have now been used, right? And so you're kind of stuck with playing it. And that adds to a lot of the chaotic beauty and funness of what this game is.
Yeah, so that rule that you mentioned that is important, and in the rules of when you play a card, it's gone. Like, I think that part is kind of a good match with the idea of it's co-op and you can communicate as much as you want, but one, you probably don't want to communicate that much because you want to save time. Mm-hmm. You really are time crunched in the game. It's really doesn't give you that much time to be like, hey, do you have this card? Do you have this card? Do you have this card? It's pretty much like once the monster comes out, you see the symbols, you just start playing the ones that you have that match it. And so then it does happen a lot where like something might just need one arrow symbol and you play one and someone else plays like a double one. So you kind of obviously reached it, but you're wasting those cards because once you played them, they're gone. And so you got to kind of have a certain kind of not communication, but sense among your team, right? Like being in the same mindset of like the timing, and maybe this player will be the one to be like the fastest in playing cards, and maybe I'll wait for him a little bit so I'm not playing ahead of him or at the same time as him. I don't know. Those are small things you figure out as a team, right? While you're playing. But it's the idea that there's that time crunch, and then that rule of once you play it, it's gone. It's like it leads to those moments where it's like, I wish we did communicate, or I wish I just waited because that card I played was like a double symbol card, which would be more useful later on. Mm-hmm. So
that's kind of the importance of like having to watch out for which cards you're playing or how many you're playing at a time. Because as you were mentioning, one of the things that can lead to the end game or to a loss in the game is running out of cards, right? So there is actually this sense and this importance of an economy of cards, even though you're trying to play cards as fast as you can, because you do need to solve or you need to get through all of the doors in order to get to the boss. So while you need to conserve enough cards so that you'll be able to fight the boss, you can't be too conservative because that means you won't get through the rest of the deck quick enough. which means you won't adventure through to get to the boss in the first place because you're over conserving, right? So, and I think that's the important, because like it pushes people who are thinkers or people who want to quote min max all the time, like myself as an alpha gamer, to not alpha game, right? You have to just kind of play cards and hope, that and see it work out, and just kind of more of the intuitive and more of just the I've just got to go with the flow, and we've just got to adapt based on what's going on, right? Because there's sometimes, because time is moving so fast, someone might have a card that can like instant defeat an event or a monster that you're fighting, but then before you get to play the card, right, you're like, oh wait, I can use it. Somebody else might have already played like a card or two, and you're just like, no, I could have beat it without wasting a card. But
Yeah, I mean,
that happens a lot.
What you mentioned too is like there are those different card types, which I think is important to keep in mind, right? Even though the rules were super simple, how we explained it in basically matching symbols, there are still different card types that then have limitations or do other things. Like certain characters, as John mentioned, have cards that can instantly defeat a monster, so you just play that one card instead of having to deal with matching the symbols. Or you have door cards that are mini bosses that then don't fall into one of those categories that that character's card can work on, because mini bosses is a type of door card, but then the other types are like obstacle, monster, and there's one more. I can't remember the last one.
Obstacle, monster, event, I think.
Oh no, person.
Oh, persons.
Yeah.
Obstacles,
So those are kind of like the three types that all the other door cards can fall into, being like an obstacle that you have to overcome as a team thematically, or a person villain, or a monster villain.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, certain characters, for example, too, this kind of goes into another pro of the player boards, not just serving as a place to put cards and discard cards, which is really simple, but all the characters have a special ability.
Mm-hmm.
And the special ability in this case with the thief is Vault, which lets you discard 3 cards from your hand to then instantly defeat an obstacle type door card. And so again, that's another way in which you have an ability like that, not just having the card that maybe does it in your deck, or someone else might have a card that defeats obstacles, but your character has that ability. And so I like that point because I like character abilities. So adding that in a really simple way, just it's written right there, discard 3, do what it says. It's a nice change up, just a slight change up from having the game be just cards.
Yeah.
Right? Just playing the card that does the thing, but your character can do a thing. And so
it kind of speaks to the use of the components in a different way, right? So as we were saying, cards typically are very easy, like game design wise, it's very easy to just make a game where you're just playing cards, or you just throw the cards out there and that's it. But in this game, you get to use them for a dual purpose. It's both cards that you do directly play, but they now have an element where you can, for the price of 3 cards, which is a lot of resource, you can do a unique ability that only your character has. And maybe other characters have like with the one that Ben just showed, is a one-off of like, maybe another player has a one-off of destroying an obstacle, but you have that all of the time, right? Which means that you always have that opportunity and that option to utilize that skill, the player's skill, that is only to that. The other nice thing, I think the boards are reversible, right?
Yes.
So you can actually flip it over, and it's a variant, and it's not the same character. So it's the same deck that you'd play with, but your skill is going to be a completely different skill. So that's the other nice thing about not just having player powers, but you have unique player powers that the actual players, as you're playing the game, or the people who are playing the game, you can kind of not just use the same deck and only have one single power. You have the option of a secondary power that you can kind of switch. So it gives you a little bit more player variety and player flavor as you play the game, which is also a nice bonus because it gives it, because this is a game that is only 5 minutes long, you will be replaying this a lot, and you will have to go through this game many, many times. So to have things that can keep it fresh, keep it kind of different when you play it, or switch things around for yourself, is a nice bonus to the game. Right? It is a positive. Versus they could have just made it where everyone is the same power and you only added the special cards to the deck. This way, it actually makes it a little bit more streamlined in keeping variety between players.
Yeah, I think there are like a bunch of small points on this too, just when we get into talking about the player power and the use of the cards. Like with what you mentioned about the use of the cards, I think that's a small thing that I didn't realize until thinking back on the game just now. From a design standpoint, it is clever that the cards are played to match symbols, but then also discarded for an ability. And there's actually like
Yes.
a discard pile, which is different from cards that you played to match symbols. And that's a part that could be kind of confusing or even seem not important to other people, to regular gamers, casual gamers. But I think from a design standpoint, that's pretty cool because it gives you a way to consider cards differently, right? In this case, and to clarify, like when you play cards to match symbols and defeat the door card, you don't pick them up again and put them on your discard pile, right? They're just, we basically, when we play, we always just swipe it all away, even like off the table at times.
It,
Like,
it tells you in the game that you need to clear the space
yeah.
and play a new card. They don't specify how to clear the space. So our standard play is
just
get it out of here.
Flip the next card. But it's clever because that's like one part of the game, right? Matching symbols, the most direct, simple way of getting at the game, and then you clear the table. But then there are abilities that then put cards into your own discard pile, and even then let you draw cards back out from your discard pile. And so that's a clever way to do it, where if you just limited yourself to one discard pile for the whole game, it could become very cumbersome, right? Especially if it is a speed game of matching symbols and then, oh wait, let's divvy up and put in some discard pile. Like, that's a waste of time. That's just interrupts the flow of the actual game. But then also having this other discard pile for your own character, it allows cards, the design of cards, to actually use cards from here. So it kind of gives the game more space to do other things.
And I think that call out with the discard pile stuff is pretty important, because when you're playing the cards, once they're played, the backs of the cards are different because of the coloring of the backs of the cards, but on the front sides of the cards, they tend to look similar or the same, at least from the general symbols that each of the cards have. And maybe Ben is bringing up a picture to show the components.
Here is the back of the card,
which is actually a symbol of the 5-minute dungeon.
Their logo, this 5-minute dungeon logo, this
cool
dragon and a 5, which is really cool that they designed it that way. And then the front of the cards is actually, let me try to get to that. Ooh.
His computer's shutting down on him because he ran out of 5 minutes. Time is up. Get out of here.
So these are like the basic resources, the front of the cards.
And so obviously you can see here, there's actually no symbolism, or other than the card symbolism, which is nice from an artwork standpoint, full art. This is the part that Ben always talks about, so I'm stealing his thunder for components. But it's full art, so it makes it very clear and very easy to see as players. But once you play the cards into the main pile, there's no way for you to tell if that was your card from your player deck or somebody else's card. So when we're talking about the skills and abilities that are in some decks that allow you to get cards back, it would be weird if you're grabbing cards from this giant pile of played cards, because you'd have to try to sort out which one you actually played, and there's no way to identify it. So it actually saves a lot from an artwork design standpoint, because they would have had to figure out how do we distinguish it on the front side if we wanted people to be able to pick up from there. But then that would kind of break your design here from it just being nice, clean art to be very clear about your symbols and the colors and such, so on and so forth. There's a lot of things that it actually was it really fits the concept of the 5-minute dungeon, or the play style of you only have 5 minutes to play. You don't have a lot of time. So this is one less thing you have to worry about thinking about to decide what to pick up. You have your discard deck where you can just pick up the cards from there, which is very separate from the actual played cards. So.
And then also with what you mentioned about the player board being dual-sided, right? I think a cool choice is also that the player board is dual-sided but uses the same deck. And so the decks actually do have a slight difference versus just having maybe unique cards to like the thief character in the deck. it also has, since it's purple, it has more purple symbols in the deck.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's another smart way that they mix it up, right? Because they really easily could have just put the same special cards and the same breakdown of these resource cards in every deck,
Mm-hmm.
right? But they actually make it slightly different, even though they are essentially trying to do the same thing together as a co-op
Mm-hmm.
game. There is still that difference. So then in your mind, once you play it more, you might get to a point where it's like, okay, I need to keep in mind that if I'm the thief, I can probably, not always, but probably deal with monsters, door cards that have this jump symbol,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And so, and as we also mentioned, these symbols are scroll, arrow, jump, sword, and shield. And so those are basically the 5 basic resources, and that's really clean from a design standpoint too. That was just my small point there. But yeah, the idea that they're double 2 characters and different art on both sides still.
Yep.
They could have also kept that the same, but they actually used
And it's also
different art.
yeah, and it's full art too, as I mentioned
It
again.
goes to the edges.
Covers the whole thing. It's fully artwork, no borders, but it's also clean. Like I like how they put the character right in the middle. And even though parts of them kind of move into the card discard pile sections, but it's still a very clear picture. The characters, it's very in character for the artwork too.
Yeah, so that's just a really great touch that they put in the effort to design it that way. Different ability, different art on both sides, and even slight differences in the decks. So those sound like small points, but I think those are really smart. It's how the game is done really smart.
Yep.
And so then other than that, there are also the bosses, right? You're always fighting one boss that you're choosing at the beginning of the game. And I think for the bosses, they all start to seem similar, right? But they still also have, let me see if I can pull one out. They also have their own art and then all the symbols that it takes to defeat them, and an indicator at the bottom of how big their dungeon is, how many cards you have to set up when fighting them. So there's just different levels of bosses, and they can get really hard. And it's mainly because of how many cards you have to go through to get to them within the 5 minutes still. All of them are still 5 minutes, and how many symbols they need themselves. And so
Final 4.
yeah, so those are the bosses, to give a little look of that. And then I think the last thing I would mention about, well, actually, another rule we didn't mention was that in fighting the boss, the rules say you have to place symbols that actually match with the boss.
Yep.
And so, I mean, there is maybe some ambiguity. Maybe it's clarified somewhere on Board Game Geek anyway, that you can look it up of, does that mean if the boss has a symbol, you can still play that card? Or you have to actually play a card that is effective in matching the symbol? So if you already played 3 swords, you can't play any more cards with swords. That's kind of either clarified on Board Game Geek, or you can kind of decide for your own gameplay. But I think that's an interesting little rule also, that does make the game harder when it gets to the boss, which is fitting. But then it's also interesting because it makes you think of what is the rule normally, which is something we haven't talked about. But what happens is, since you have a hand limit, you basically are stuck with working with the symbols you have in your hand. But the rule of when you play a card, it's gone. That means, you could, in a way, accidentally play a card that doesn't do anything. But then since you go under your hand limit, you automatically get to then draw from your own deck up to your hand limit. And so that's a way that you will probably go through like a lot of the dungeons of, playing cards to get rid of them that you don't think are useful, just to draw new cards to get something that you need immediately. So that's a little bit of the simple strategy that comes up in the game, right? The decision you have to make when to do that. But then you can't do that when you're fighting the boss.
Yeah. And it kind of is effective for some of the character powers as well, because some of the character powers, as we shared, are defeating or destroying, monsters or obstacles that are in the way. So when you go to the boss, you're not going to be able to use that power at all because the boss is not an obstacle. It's not a monster or anything like that. So one of the ways that you can get rid of cards is by using that power, right? To just get rid of your cards to discard. But you no longer have that option against the boss, for example, right? So it adds some complexity to when you actually face these bosses at the end of the game, where it's not just a bigger version. It's not just strictly a bigger version of the cards that you've been playing up until this point.
And then the last pro I would have for the game is the app that they designed for the game. When they launched the game on Kickstarter, that's when they also made the app for the game, which is its own separate timer. And so I did mention the rules, like, yeah, you set a timer for 5 minutes and you play within that time. But they actually designed an app for it that you can kind of choose different voices, different voice actors, voiceovers they got for it. And I would recommend getting the app because it's just a simple timer app and it's colorful and it fits the game. It's made by them. But then the voices are funny. They're done really well. This game is fantasy, but in more of a kind of goofy, funny way, in a really light way. And so the voiceovers like do jump in and say funny things every so often. They have like different tones or moods you can set when you're starting the game with that specific voiceover. So it's well done. And I don't usually like having like a digital component to my board games because that's from my own view of I would then rather just play a video game if I'm using electronic stuff. And I like the analog aspect of board games. But since it's such a simple app and you're either going to use your own timer anyways, you might as well use this nice one that they designed, which I think is well done.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, and so with that, we will go on to the cons, the weak points of this game. John?
I'll start off with, so the end state of the game and transitioning to start a new game is kind of a bit of a pain point of this game. Mainly because, as we were talking about, like the fun chaotic aspect of everyone's playing cards in the middle, there's a big mess of cards that kind of get played, everyone's playing in the same pile effectively, you're flipping through these door cards really quickly to get through so you can get to the final boss. While fun to play, every time you play this game you have to reset everything, right? So it's kind of a slog because it's basically you spend as much time playing the game as you do resetting up the game. It kind of almost has the Jenga feel of having to reset a game when you play Jenga. This game is more fun than Jenga, so this is not to say this game is at the low comparative level of Jenga, like we talked about in our Bling Bling Gemstone review. But I do think that it is kind of annoying because you have to sift through all the cards and then you have to flip them all over and then you have to kind of reset the decks and you have to make the door cards set up again. And there's certain events when you set up the bosses, there's ways you set up their deck, so you have to sort those cards out too. So there's a few different pieces or a few different areas of all the components that you have to set up to get the next game set up. That is a little bit, it can be a little bit taxing given that you're playing through these games pretty quickly. So to have to reset everything, that takes, I would probably say, maybe a minute to 2 minutes, which is effectively half of the time you spent playing the game. So it's a lot of times you setting up and playing the game, and that's almost a comparably equal level.
Yeah, that is why I mentioned during the brief rules that it's maybe almost a 10-minute game because you're playing for 5 minutes and then maybe, like discussing or kind of cheering about it, and then you have to clean up and set it up again within those other minutes. But it's still, in a sense, not that bad. But yeah, it does have that sense of like, you got to do that every time.
Yeah.
And then I think for me, something that does stick with me from the game is the kind of light, humorous take on fantasy, which I don't know if I've come across a lot in board games. There's a lot of fantasy in board games, but ones that like do it in a either cute or funny or family friendly way. I don't, it doesn't come to mind that much. But the sad thing is, and actually I'll give some examples, like it just has this kind of creative humor on the cards. And actually I think none of the cards are repeated, which I think is great. It has their own art. Each monster, obstacle, door card is different. But then you have like certain creative humor, like a timber wolf, like a wolf made out of timber, wood, or an arm dealer who's actually dealing arms. And the one that I remember the most, jack-o'-lanterns.
Appropriate for Halloween coming up.
Like it has this kind of nice art, full art on the cards, as John has mentioned, and this kind of humor to it. But because you're just matching symbols, you don't get to pay attention to any of it when you're actually playing the game. Like you're not going to stop and read the name of the card. You're going to be flipping over the door card and being like, okay, we need 2 swords. And it's a monster if someone can defeat a monster. But that's it. Like you won't even look at the name. The artwork might not register with you.
Yeah.
And then you're just playing matching cards and then swiping it away. And so that's, for me, is unfortunate because in a sense that is the theme of the game, right? And it's there, but you don't feel that it's there. So that's unfortunate for me.
Yeah. I mean, as a positive, again, in the sense of like it's really good art, and I think if it was worse art it would be even worse of a situation, because then it's like then it feels really generic. But this also kind of moves into a little bit of my own more of a mechanics criticism a little bit, is that the way that the game scales in difficulty is pretty basic. In the sense that as you scale up boss by boss, the only change that's really happening when you're playing the game is you're just adding more cards into the deck that you have to beat. So yes, it does mean that you have to be more frugal and more thoughtful about how you're playing cards, and you have to have a better synergy with your team as to who is using what, utilizing what resources and such. It kind of feels artificial. It's kind of like an inflation of artificial difficulty. So especially for all my video gamers out there who may be watching this, it's a lot of those games where you fight bosses, or like when you play at higher level difficulties in a game, that it's not that tactically the game gets harder. It's just that monsters become like HP bullet or HP sponges, basically, where you just have to keep dealing and using the same strategy and the same kind of tactic over and over until you just endurance your way through the battle. I would say that this game kind of gets that feeling, especially when you get to the highest level, when you basically are using every single door deck or dark card in the game, in the final boss's deck. My personal preference would have been actually if they added more varied cards into it, more like events or more traps that were more part of the game itself, which, as I mentioned, I think I was mentioning before, there's, when you set up the decks, it's not just pure door cards. There's the obstacle event cards that you have a separate unique deck of those, and you choose a selection of those out, and they get added into the door deck to add. So I almost feel like I would have rather seen more of these kinds of cards to really give you more variety of what is actually happening throughout the game. But because that doesn't really change, the game ends up feeling a little bit like bullet spongy, or like HP spongy at the end feeling, or just like this, it becomes just a lot of resources, like just resource management without adding anything special, or like the bosses having like a special thing that happens when you trigger them, right? So when you trigger the end boss state, maybe it does a one-time effect that affects your players, right? That would have been a pretty fun or a pretty interesting thing they did, where it's not just like a monster you have to fight, but it's a monster and an event combined, or a monster and obstacle combined together, where it does 2 different effects, right? Where it's, you have to get all these resources to take care of them, and there's something that happens at the start where it's like all players must discard their hand, and that's it, right? Or like I don't know, something else, or like redraw the last 3 door cards and you have to fight those door cards before you fight the boss again. I don't know, like something like that, right? Some simple thing that you can do to just make the bosses a little bit unique from each other versus just a lot of symbols that you have to play at that point.
So yeah, I mean, did you have any other I think the last thing I would bring up is with production related. It's actually, so I mentioned comparing the art. So just to give you guys an idea, this is my copy from Kickstarter. So it's actually, I think, an exclusive artwork for the box. And as John has mentioned, like this whole full art idea, I mean, I think that's always looks nice in a game. And so to kind of put that on the whole box, I mean, even the original one that John has in his picture, it is still full art. But for me, it's also just the idea that I know this is exclusive. And so that's kind of a Kickstarter exclusivity issue that some people in the board gaming industry are not keen on, where I am usually okay for it because I'm on Kickstarter so much. So I do get the exclusive things. But I will say this is actually a negative, not to do with the art, but is that it's well produced, but it does feel like the box is actually not that sturdy. It feels a little cheap. Like if you were to actually able to feel this, it's kind of thin and gives a bit. Compared to a lot of the bigger box games we've shown, it's kind of like that harder feeling, harder coating
like
on the
harder,
box.
thicker cardboard.
Yeah, and so I mean, I take good care of my stuff, so there's not like holes through it. But I can imagine if you do drop this, it could like rip or something, maybe like if you drop stuff on it, like a heavy mug or something.
Or you have something sit on top of it for an extended period of time. It'll.
So that's just
I
a
may
small
say that because I have
thing.
experience at that.
No.
I do, because you take good care of your board games. Maybe I don't necessarily.
But then actually to go on with the production, I mean, that's just a small thing, right? It just has a sense of it is cheaper. And I mean, it is actually in retail now, like at, I think, Walmart and maybe even Target. And so it is mass produced for that, which is fine. But it's just kind of giving you a sense that that's how the box might feel. But also then to go on with the production, to give you guys an idea of, that was the Kickstarter exclusive art. The one that John's showing was the original art for people who I think got it early on, or also from Kickstarter, just not the exclusive art. And then there is the version that you'll probably see in stores now. Let me see if I can pull that up. Your copy would look like this. And so it's like this hourglass shape and has like different artwork on the front. So that's what you would see if you were to pick this up at a retail store now. And I don't know actually how it feels either. I don't know if it actually has this kind of paper material feeling as mine does. Mm-hmm. But I do think that hourglass shape is weird. Especially since the game doesn't have a sand timer in it, unless the new version does.
Maybe it does now.
Huh?
I was gonna say it's also interesting because the artwork looks like the heroes definitely changed in this artwork. I don't know if it's in the game. It definitely looks like they're focusing on more of the family-friendly aspect of the game in this, where it looks clearly like a family in this dungeon section, where it's it looks like a mom and a dad with 2 kids playing, right? Like to play this game, right? Which again, and so we're kind of shifting out of negatives a little bit. Like there is a nice appeal to this game because it is a symbols matching. So you really can actually play. I think it says ages 8 and plus, but if your kids are mature enough, like I actually feel like they could probably pick this up pretty quickly because it really is just color matching and symbol matching. So as long as they're able to kind of understand that concept for the most part, other than like the cards that they have to read the text on. So maybe you could play a variation where they don't have those cards, or you make it, or you just have them throw the card out and then whether it works or not, and then that's fine. But there's definitely that aspect that this is something that, you can have your generally younger children playing. So, because even at ages 8, that's a pretty low age for this kind of game, I would say, right? For real time, you got 5 minutes, and then you have to do this, and there's actually quite a bit of stuff going on in the game. So I've moved from negatives back into positives.
Yeah, I mean that was actually kind of the last point I had too, that it's a small negative on the material of the box, but again, like I kept mentioning the artwork, which I think is done really well in the game. It's not even the style that I actually like with fantasy, but because I know it's this kind of goofy fantasy and not even like gross funny, it's just goofy funny, which I'm fine with, and it's done very colorfully, which is really great too. And so yeah, that was kind of my last point. And so the last thing we would want to mention before getting onto our scores and the weight is there is an expansion to the game that was also on Kickstarter. And so I put all my set into the expansion box, which is 5-minute dungeon, curses, foiled again. And I think part of that was the idea of there being foiled cards, like shiny cards that came with it. I don't actually remember if that's true. I think that might be true though. It does introduce like artifact cards, which are basically one-time use for the whole game, but you basically get to put one artifact into your own deck at the start of a game. And yeah, you can only use it once during that whole game. And it introduces 2 new characters. And so that's basically all it adds. I mean, I don't want to call out the designer too much on this. I do feel there was some kind of issue that I didn't pay attention to when backing it on Kickstarter, that after I got it, it seemed like the new cards are a different size than the first edition cards. So that actually is a reason why I haven't really tried it. But I think I did, when I put everything together into the same box, I did figure out actually the cards that can go together and cards that maybe don't need to be mixed together. But it was just, I just remember my initial reaction was like, how come these cards are different sizes? Like,
Gotta
it might
take
just
scissors and cut the edges off.
Like, I think what I might have realized later is it might have been just the new characters, their own decks of cards are a different size slightly, but it doesn't really matter because you're not mixing decks anyway.
Well,
yeah.
If you play the 2-player variation, you can mix decks because you're
yes, that actually is an interesting twist.
But that's
too.
the 2-player variant. You're supposed to be
Yeah.
playing this with more people.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, John mentioned the 2-player because you do mix decks in that case because you need enough cards essentially to play as if you had enough players and cards to fight through a dungeon. But aside from the expansion, they also had a third Kickstarter, a different kind of game, but still a 5-minute game, which I am excited to actually maybe unbox later on. And I kind of even want to try it solo just so I can kind of learn it before John ruins it for me. And is 5-minute mystery, which I think looks really cool. It has this kind of anthropomorphic animal kind of.
Do you want to wait? Do you want to stop sharing your screen so it's bigger?
Thank you.
All good. There you go.
There you go. 5-minute mystery. Oh, the glare from the light. But yeah, it's this kind of anthropomorphic characters, these animal characters, which I think is done well. And it's a co-op game that's about solving a mystery within 5 minutes. And it even has like a certain kind of hard plastic toy decoder in it that you need to use to solve the mysteries. So yeah, this is another kind of branch off from this whole 5-minute series, I guess, that they're doing.
Ben, send me one of the decks and one of the decoder things, and I'll just play it from my location here. You point your camera at the thing, and you'll flip all the cards for me.
You'll just solve it for all of us watching.
I'll help you solve it. Easy.
So yeah, so that's a cool spin, I think, on this 5-minute idea. which at least from what I kind of looked at again on the Kickstarter, you know, it obviously keeps that 5-minute idea, which I like, that real time aspect, but then making it into a deduction kind of game. That's the part that I also like. But I'm also kind of curious at how hard it is. And anyways, that's something you might also be interested in if this 5-minute series interests you. And so going on to our ratings, and John guesses the weight. And to clarify,
do we want to talk about the Marvel version, or are we going to keep
oh,
that
yeah. Sorry. Yes. There was also one version in between before 5-minute mystery called 5-minute Marvel. And it is
just in case
essentially like the game we've been describing, the base game, 5-minute dungeon, with a Marvel theme. There are slight differences where you have a few more characters. I remember I used to have it, but I didn't want to keep all these 5-minute versions of the game, so I just kept my Kickstarter version. But from having 5-minute Marvel, you had characters like Spider-Man, Spider-Gwen. I think that's before she came out in the movie, right? It had Iron Man. Who else was there?
Squirrel Girl.
Yeah, that's right. Squirrel Girl. Oh, and I think there was a Medusa. I think one of the Inhumans.
Yeah. I think so.
And Captain America, Hulk. So it did have some, out there characters that people might not know about, but they actually do have. I know those characters are in actual Marvel animated shows, though. So maybe they're getting a little more attention these years. But yeah, they are obscure characters. And then it just played a little differently because there actually was a common deck of all the resource cards, of all the symbols. And then you basically deal that out to each character, each player. And so they have a deck. They basically have 2 decks. They'll have a deck of those common cards that they can draw from. And then they had, I think, like 10 cards that were specific to their character, which served as another deck. So that when you're refilling your hand to your hand limit during the game, you can choose which deck you want to draw from. And so that was okay. I mean, we're not reviewing that game, but I would say that change from what John had explained before, it kind of does make things a little cumbersome, having actual 2 different decks to help you keep track of things separately.
Even more that you have to separate at the end of the game.
Yeah, because you are playing cards from your own hero deck or the common cards. So it's just another set of cards you need to separate out and treat differently. So small cumbersome issue with it, which is why I kind of prefer this original dungeon fantasy version more. And so, but if you like the Marvel theme, that would be the way to try the game out too. And so now onto rating and weight. And just to clarify, and I noticed that, we haven't clarified this in other videos recently, but when we talk about weight, we're not talking about the physical weight of the game. But
Although we could.
we could. John would never guess it correctly.
Yeah, I would be so wrong most of the time.
But we're talking about kind of the complexity and how many things are going on in a game, how difficult it is or easy it is to learn a game and play a game well, or even set it up. And so it's all those kind of aspects that go into, I think, what the Board Game Geek community considers part of the weight of a game. And so that is what John will be guessing to win a copy of 5-Minute Dungeon. But ratings first.
So I would say ratings-wise, I think I would give this game I'd probably give it a 7.25 is kind of my thought. I don't think it's a 7. I don't think it's just a base 7. I think it is a little bit better quality and better production, generally speaking, despite the fact that I talked about a number of negatives, or a couple of negatives that are, I think, kind of would affect the replayability. But I still think it's a very solid game. It's very fun, very easy to pick up. It's very quick for people to learn, and it's a quick game itself, right? 5 minutes, you just run through it, it's fast. But I don't think it's quite at the level of a 7.5 game, because it's not something that I'm really raring to be like, hey, let's play this let's play this regularly or play this a lot. but I don't think it's at the same level. Yeah, so that's why I'm kind of in between the 7 and the 7.5. So I'll take a nice 7.25 to split that rating a little bit.
So for me, while we've been talking about it, I've been wanting to maybe change my rating that I had already had, because when I first opened up my Board Game Geek page and saw my review of it, I was like, oh, really? Did I give it that? And so maybe I wanted to increase it from especially the pros we were talking about. But I think ultimately the description again on how Board Game Geek describes each rating, what I gave it is correct. I gave it a 6.5.
Ooh,
And
so low.
and that's because I kept thinking if I should push it up to a 7. And I think 7 is described as usually willing to play. And I think for me at this point, I played it a lot. And at this point, it's more often that it's something like when we have a game night, I'll ask kind of what starting filler game do we want to play? And that's when someone else will mention it, where I might not be the one to suggest it as the intro game that we play for the night. And so that's where I kind of see it in between a 6, which is, I think, we'll play it in the mood, and a 7, which is, I think, usually wants to play. And so, yeah, and I think, I mean, that doesn't mean it's a bad game. Like, I'm still, again, willing to play it, and we'll be down to play several rounds of it when we do play it. But we probably play like at least like three times every time we play it, right?
Mm.
But yeah, I just found that I'm not the one necessarily recommending it or bringing it up. Where
Ben would rather recommend Strike or Bling Bling than stuff.
And so it's when other people
reviews.
know about the game already that they'll be like, oh yeah, maybe that'll be a quick intro game for us to play tonight. And so then, yes, that's when, how it usually happens. That's when I'll be down to play it. Mm-hmm. So 6.5 from me, 7.25 from John. And then the weight, John is going to guess?
2.37.
Okay. And let us unveil the actual weight of the game. 1.11.
This is a 1.11? Are you serious?
You're so off.
I am completely off.
John has trouble with time and cooperating and matching symbols, colors and symbols. It's complicated for him.
I feel like there was another game that was something like this too. And it was
you gave it a 2.3. Dude, I think isn't that more than what you gave Hanabi? Hanabi is more complex than this.
That is true. This is a pretty simple game. Huh. Well, I'm totally off. So this is why I don't do weight. This is why weight is not important. Hey, my rating is closer to the standard view of people,
the average rating. Yes,
I'll take that over my weight approximations.
Oh man,
maybe it's because I try to take this to the next level.
But yeah, there you guys are. That's our review of 5 Minute Dungeon. Like I mentioned, you can find this version or the Marvel version probably in retail stores like Walmart and Target nowadays. And so if this interests you, hope you'll pick it up, give it a try. And if you found this review helpful, hope you'll share it with your family and friends. And so until next time, we'll see you then. Bye.
Bye.